Okay, we're back with more heated rivalry analysis, backed by popular demand. And if you haven't seen my previous character analysis of Ilya or Shane, you can pause this video, stop, and go back and check those out. Some of what I talked about there is going to play into this, where I talk about their interaction style. So I'm going to give you a quick little disclaimer, and that is, I know a bit about personality types since I've been studying that, but all the stuff that I've been studying that has to do with more of their psychology, this has just been fun stuff that I've been exploring. It's not like I'm a professional, so take it with a grain of salt. This is meant for entertainment purposes only. So we're going to just jump into it. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we love them as a couple. So I think why we love them is that they're sort of complementary, or opposites, I guess. You've got Ilya, who's like this bad boy character, and then you have Shane, who's like this very genuine and like humble guy, right? And I think that dynamic is really fascinating. We have like the shy versus the brash, the humble versus the braggadocious. And you can see where conflict is going to arise with that kind of combination, but they also have different strengths that will help them grow together. Furthermore, the reason this show has been so great is that it's kind of a fantasy. Like, I don't know how many of you guys knew about hockey before. I mean, maybe generally the idea of hockey. I don't know much about hockey to begin with. And so it's almost like this different world, right? It's got these weird rules. It's like hyper masculine. There's ice and danger and fighting. So part of that creates a fantasy element that is fun to watch. And then these characters are also really like fantastical in certain elements too. Like, it's very far from our lives. They're super rich. They're super famous. And it kind of allows us to get into this fantasy space, this different world. And they're kind of separate from financial concerns, which can be something that weighs down a lot of relationships. So this one's kind of fun to watch purely for the other dynamics. And the other reason why this being a fantasy is fun, because there's just so much other crap going on in this world right now. It's nice to, have an escape, something that's a completely different world. I think the other reason why we love Hollanov so much is that they're very authentic characters. So despite the fact that this is a completely different world, they don't have to worry about money. I think the other thing that we love about them is that they're very authentic people that we can relate to. They're going through their very first relationship, and it's fun to kind of watch the evolution from liking to loving. So the first thing I want to talk about is attachment style. And attachment style is born out of the relationship that you have with your caregivers when you're young. And it really affects a lot of your life after that. It affects how we characterize ourselves, other people, and relationships. So I'm going to start with Shane, who had a secure attachment. So his parents were very responsive to his needs growing up. They gave him latitude to explore, things on his own, but also provided a place to fall back to if things got too overwhelming. So by having this sort of strong relationship with his parents, he was able to develop a really good sense of self. He could trust in himself to some degree. And then he also had a good relationship with others in the sense that he felt like other people, some of them, can be trusted. And furthermore, relationships were a support network for him. So relationships were good. Now, I know you can think of some examples of where that's not true for Shane, and we'll dive into that deeper, but I just want to give you this general overview of, in general, he knows his self-worth, and he understands that people are safe to some degree. By contrast, I want to talk about Ilya, who has a disorganized attachment. So Ilya grew up in a household where there was a lot of stuff going on through it. So he had a loving mother for a period of time, right? So that he knew that he can go to her. She was probably responsive to some of his needs, although I'm sure she was not responsive to some of his needs as well, because she was going through depression herself. Alternately, he had his father, who was extremely critical, his brother, who was also kind of critical. And so he has all these different scripts running, which is, mom is sometimes responsive to my needs, dad is never, mom goes away, and now I'm just left with this. So there wasn't a coherent script that he could develop in his head on how to react to different people and different emotions. Was he supposed to run towards them or away from them? And you can kind of see this in the previous character analysis I did of Ilya, where he has some avoidant tendencies and he has some clingy, anxious tendencies. Because his parents were so inconsistent, he couldn't develop a coherent script about how to react in different situations. And that has really affected his feeling about himself and others and just relationships in general. So I think it becomes quite evident that he has a low self-worth. He considers himself maybe partly unlovable, and we see that in some of the ways that he speaks out loud. But his mother, who left him at a very young age, made him feel like, okay, my love wasn't good enough. So his level of self-worth is pretty low. And when you grow up in this kind of inconsistent household where sometimes you react by clinging to somebody and sometimes you run away from them and you get different responses, it makes it very difficult to regulate your emotions and self-soothe. And when he looks at other people, his views on them kind of fluctuate, right? Because he doesn't know what to expect with them. He might alternately be clingy or avoidant. He might expect people to fulfill his needs and then also feel that no one else can help him, that he can just rely on himself. So in general, with relationships, he feels people, they're unpredictable, relationships, not safe. He might want intimacy, but can't help but self-sabotage. Before we get much further, I'd love for you to pause and let me know in the comments if you agree with this analysis so far. Do you have some, counterpoints? I love learning from you guys, and this has been a really fun experience for me. So next I want to talk about some learned behavior that came about from their attachment styles, but also from how they grew up and some experiences that they had. So to start off with Shane, I'd say that he's become very outcome oriented. It's certainly part of his personality type as an ISTJ to kind of link achievement to self-worth. But I would also say his mother has overemphasized that, and she's put a lot of pressure on him. And then the hockey world is also rewarding him when he does well in hockey. And so he has probably tied a bit of his self-worth into achievement. So the next topic I want to talk about with Shane is perfectionism. And this is something that we see with him a lot, whether it's coming up with a very perfect plan so that he and Ilya can be together, even smaller plans so that they can meet in secret, all to kind of contain the chaos. Maybe even his diet being very specific. He's trying to control the chaos by narrowing his focus on this one thing and being really perfect at it. But perfectionism is grounded in fear. So what's happening is that you're kind of getting a low level of cortisol the entire time that you're trying to tunnel vision into this perfect plan, this perfect vision that you have in the future. And living with low levels of cortisol, well, it has the same effect that stress does on the body and mental outcomes that come from that. The reason cortisol comes out is it's that flight or fight kind of hormone, so that if a lion is coming at you, you can say like, oh, let me run away or fight. It narrows the field of vision to black and white. There's no nuance because that's what you need in that kind of situation. But in everyday life, we need to see context because things are constantly changing and evolving. And if you've narrowed your focus so much, it makes it really hard to actually troubleshoot other situations. You can't see other options. You just see the black and white. And then also you're chasing perfection. And what is perfection? It's constantly changing. The goalposts are constantly moving. I don't know if you've thought about maybe what you liked as a teenager, what you thought would be a perfect life. If you were living that 10 years later, 20 years later, I'm sure it would just be a disaster. So what you thought was perfect at 16 is not perfect at 26, 36, what have you. So again, the idea of perfection changes because you change, context change, and that's why it's so important to not be so tunnel visioned that you forget the bigger picture. And sometimes the bigger picture is what is important to me as a human, my relationship. Shane is trying so hard to protect his relationship because in general, change is very difficult for him. As an ISTJ, they like incremental change over time, but something that could completely 180 flip something. They don't like the unknown. And so his perfectionist tendencies are him trying to fix this unfixable situation by focusing really hard on one area. And it sort of makes it so he disregards the feelings of others, himself, and perhaps Ilya. So one thing that's great is that Ilya is able to sort of take him out of his head. You know, he has this joking manner. He sort of calls out the obvious for him, gives him greater context, because left unchecked, this perfectionist quality can be very detrimental to his mental health and then to the feelings of other people around him. So the next thing I want to talk about Shane is his autism. This is not brought up in the show or in the book, but I believe the author has later been interviewed and said that that kind of coalesced specifically for the show and for the books, I believe too, but that he kind of goes undiagnosed. And while anybody can be on the autism spectrum and be any personality type, it definitely does feed into an ISTJ's need for stability and predictability. And what has been helpful for him is to be reminded that he has a safe space. So when in episode 6, he gets overwhelmed and kind of has, he's just kind of panicking, his mom and dad, look at him as if they've seen this before. And Ilya immediately goes there and says, hey, you're in a safe space. You have your parents here. You have your boyfriend here. And that makes him feel better. And he knows to trust that this is a safe space because he's had a secure attachment. He knows his parents have his back. And Ilya is very good at taking him out of this tunnel black and white vision so that he can see that, yes, I am safe here and right now. So let's move on to Ilya a little bit and his learned behaviors. So because of how Ilya was raised, where he got different responses from different caregivers at different times, he has developed a lot of self-doubt. So when you're criticized as a kid, you feel like you've made a mistake. It's really hard as a child to think that, oh, this is my father just projecting his own insecurities onto me, or he's having a bad day. You internalize that you've been making a mistake. And often we see that we use a different feeling to cover up a more detrimental feeling. So as you get older, you would use self-doubt in place of feeling unlovable. It is preferable to feel like a disappointment because that's something you've been practicing your whole life. Ilya feels more comfortable being a disappointment to himself and to others. He's lazy, right? As it protects him from feeling unlovable. If he gives Shane an actual chance, by letting him in, he risks finding out that he's actually unlovable. So this is safer. So we see a lot of self-sabotage throughout the season because of how he grew up with all this criticism and inconsistency. Ilya uses overindulgence to cope with difficult emotions. In episode 5, Ilya's father passes away, and the way that he's able to cope with that is to ask Shane for phone sex. That's another way that he copes with it, is kind of this overindulgence of the sensory world. We see a lot of drinking, smoking. These are sort of coping mechanisms that he's developed to deal with difficult feelings. Ilya's childhood has led to maybe some erratic emotions that he feels. He might be by turns clingy or even, hateful towards Shane, maybe in a joking fashion, jealous, but there's a lot of stuff bubbling under the surface. That jealousy stems from a kind of hypervigilance. So when you grow up in a household where you don't know what to expect, you're trying to read the signs. For example, if you grew up with an alcoholic, oh, I can tell by the way that they're walking that they've had 3 beers, or I can tell by how high their voice is, how drunk they are more likely to get violent. So while Ilya did not necessarily grow up with someone who was an alcoholic, he grew up with someone who was extremely volatile, and he's probably reading the cues, physical or even in words, what these might mean so that he can translate them. So he has a hypervigilance around maybe what's going on with Shane, and paired with his self-doubt makes him jealous of Rose. I think jealousy might also arise because Ilya is aware that there are other nice men in Montreal, as his father points out, and that would be an easier situation for Shane to deal with rather than Ilya's, relationship that has so much baggage with it. One of the things that humans do in general is that they create a narrative of how the world works for them, almost like a lens through which they see how different events are happening. So for Ilya, he's had a couple of examples. First, his mother leaves him. He loves her dearly and she abandons him. And then he sees that a second time when he finally opens up a little bit to Shane, and Shane leaves him. So he has this narrative going on in his life that if I show people that I love them, they might leave me. And Shane's discomfort with change makes him create a narrative for himself as well. Shane is sort of waiting for the world to force a decision on him. So even when he comes out, it's really Rose that, facilitates that process. Then his father finds him and Ilya together and forces the next coming out scenario. And so he's had all these different times when the world has sort of forced him to come out. So I think that has informed how he plans the next steps of their lives, right? So he has a plan where they create a charity, Ilya moves to Ottawa, and it's a way to avoid, the world forcing him to come out in this way. He's not coming up with a lot of contingency plans. It's this plan or no plan. Again, it's that perfectionism. So next I want to talk about how they each deal with conflict. And specifically for Ilya, he's pretty good at being blunt and almost forcing conflict with a lot of people. He chirps at Scott Hunter on the ice. He needles Shane a lot. So he's pretty confident being blunt about his opinions and kind of pushing people past their limits. But when it comes to his feelings, he is not comfortable with that. So in some of these circumstances, when it comes to these higher stake emotions, he uses a mental process called introverted intuition. And introverted intuition loves to run simulations about how things are going to happen in the future. And he does a little bit of that in these times, but it's sort of like a test drive of things. I don't know if you've noticed in a couple of scenes where he'll speak under his breath when he's preparing himself for something emotionally taxing. Whether it's in episode 5 when he sees Shane walking towards him and he's preparing himself for what he's going to say, or even when he sees his brother calling and is sort of test driving underneath his breath, saying a word without speaking it out loud. We also see this when he's in the tunnel in Russia after his father's death, and he finally admits to himself that he loves Shane. It's in another language, so Shane can't understand it, so it's a test drive of his true feelings. And even when he's at the cottage, he also test drives it by first saying, I like you, and then later on is able to say, I love you. And even in that I love you scene, he says it in Russian first. Again, he kind of test drives something with one foot in something comfortable, whether it's not using a voice or using another language, to feel out whether or not he can speak this out loud. You could even look at episode 6 where he goes with Shane to his parents' house after his father discovers them. He gets to see a test run of what it would look like to come out, right? So in theory, this is Ilya's test drive of coming out, because this is the first time that he's sort of mentioning that he's bisexual to anybody. Now, when we talk about dealing with conflict with Shane, he has a completely different approach. When Shane has uncomfortable feelings, he's more likely to sort of, go off by himself, lick his wounds, and sort of process that. He needs space. I think we notice that he struggles to articulate his true emotional feelings. These are very heavy things for him. So when we are with Rose in the restaurant and she is sort of facilitating his coming out, she is asking questions and he is able to nod and respond almost like in a physical way, because it is so hard for him to get out those words. In general, ISTJs don't really honor their feelings, and they might use another feeling to get some separation from the situation. So they might use pride or defensiveness when provoked. I think it's kind of interesting to see how we tend to overvalue our own experience. We tend to give what we want to get. So, for example, when Shane is confronted with Ilya's, emotional distress and English is too hard, Shane gives Ilya what Shane usually needs, which is space. He gives him space to say what he wants in Russian without Ilya understanding. And for Ilya, he likes dealing with things in real time. He kind of needles Shane and sort of pushes him. That's what will create rapport, which is something that Ilya cares about, keeping a connection with somebody. And in doing so, he is pushing Shane to admit his true feelings. Ilya wants a visceral kind of in-the-moment reaction, because to him, feelings are actionable. Okay, so now we're going to take a more fun detour to understanding their kind of Subdom situation that they have. And I guess I want to preface this by saying that, sexual fantasy and, psychologically what's going on in your life, they are completely unrelated. Sure, maybe one could inform them or not, but there's nothing wrong with you if you prefer being a sub or a dom. It doesn't speak to any sort of like, I was damaged as a child. It's just fun, right? But if we do want to play into the idea of like a sub and a dom, in the physical world, perhaps Shane wants to do that because everything is clear. It's laid out. He's got instructions. He knows what to do. And again, he can just nod or say yes to someone else's questions. In the rest of the world, he has trouble trying to figure out what people want from him. And this is a place where he can relax and just be told what to do. So that might be a very freeing thing for him. By contrast, Ilya doesn't have a lot of control over his life. He's got his dad telling him what to do, his brother dictating stuff, and he doesn't have a lot of control about being his true self. So here he gets to control the situation, and perhaps that makes it more fun and kinky. I think you can also look at it in terms of like an emotional dom and sub, and I think they alternate playing this position. I think at first you'll see that Shane is the one that's progressing their relationship emotionally. In Tampa at the award show, it's Shane that's pushing this. And he's the one that is recognizing that this is an emotional bond. And even in episode 5, he's the one that is pushing Ilya emotionally. He has more of this, top energy when it comes to emotions. And for Ilya, he is sort of being guided by Shane to some degree. Later on, we can see that once Ilya feels comfortable like owning this, that he sees this truth that he can't unsee, that he and Shane are linked and that this is what he wants, he feels more comfortable playing this very supportive character as well, where he is comforting Shane when Shane is falling apart over his parents' discovery of him. I was just thinking about like love languages, and while I don't know a lot about that, it's pretty easy to see that for them, physical touch is a love language. They're always playing footsie. It gives them a feeling of like, okay, I got your back, right? And then all the other physical touch that we see throughout the show, this is a place that makes them feel loved. The other love language I think we see is words of affirmation. Shane reminds him in the cottage that that's not what this is. So when they're doing things that are sort of risky, that's not what their relationship is about. It might have started off that way, but this is a true relationship. So here are some words of affirmation to that effect. Even when Ilya mentions this sort of insecurity of his about being lazy, something his father has told him he is, Shane sort of gives him the word of affirmation that I haven't seen that side of you at all. Ilya also returns the favor with words of affirmation when Shane is reeling from his father catching him. He says, don't worry, they're going to talk to you and you're brave. So he really supports him in this moment. I'm really curious if you guys agree with the physical top and emotional bottom stuff I just described. So if you could leave me a note in the comments, let me know what your take was and what evidence you have for it. I think that would be great. So next I want to talk about the future of the relationship. We have a whole season 2. And while I read the book, I'm not going to give any spoilers. I mostly just want to pose some questions to get you thinking about how these things are set up and how it might affect their future relationship. So as we leave the cottage, let's kind of establish the situation that we've set ourselves up with. Shane has strategized a way to protect their careers and image from scrutiny. So he's focusing on all these outcomes instead of the larger picture of their love and relationship, which is pretty typical of an immature version of his type. By being stuck in his protectionist, perfectionist fear state, he has manufactured a plan that disregards the impact on Ilya and even his own feelings. I want to emphasize this current plan that they have for the future and the inherent imbalance embedded in it. Shane gets a really convenient situation. He gets to stay with the Montreal Metros, a team that's doing extremely well. He gets to have his boyfriend 2 hours away from him. His family's 2 hours away from him. Things are set up to make him feel better. Meanwhile, Ilya pretty much moves his entire life to accommodate Shane. He leaves his team that he has been a captain of, that he has led to victory, and he's moving to a new team, all new people, and we later on find out that actually this team hasn't been performing well for decades. He doesn't have any familiar friends like Svetlana around anymore, and he has no familiar teammates. Furthermore, the coping mechanisms that he used before to deal with stuff, emotional stuff, they're not really available to him anymore. He's in a committed relationship, so he's not going to be promiscuous. There's a question of whether hockey will be competitive for him now that he's moving to a team that is just not performing well. In the books, they sort of talk about how Ilya really likes fast cars and Shane, thinks that they're dangerous. And that's another thing that Ilya would throw himself into, a very immersive, overindulgent life that might not be available to him once he moves to a frozen tundra like Ottawa. So what's left of his coping mechanisms? There's other overindulgence like eating a lot or smoking. He's no longer a caretaker for his father, so his whole life becomes about Shane, but then there's still hockey players, they're still traveling constantly. He has changed his entire life purpose to be around Shane, and then Shane may not be there because that's just the nature of the hockey business. He gave up Russia, so he's not in his homeland. He's not able to speak Russian. Svetlana is based out of Boston, so that's the other person he speaks to in Russian. That's gone. Ilya is also not out to anyone except for, Shane's parents. So he's not out to anybody who he actually cares about, who's a confidant. So all of this might reawaken some latent depression that he might have been harboring all this time, that he'd been distracting himself away from, using all of this overindulgence. And then the question might arise, is he likely to tell Shane about this? Has he done that in the past? Or is he likely to be avoidant, erratic? Is he going to test drive saying things to Shane in a different way? So these are questions you might think about as we eagerly await season 2. So while there's a lot of complementary aspects of their personality within this relationship, they push each other to grow, whether that's Ilya pushing Shane to get out of his head or Shane providing a sense of stability for Ilya. There's still an innate conflict in their relationship. Ilya has a preference for living as his true self, living as someone who is separate from societal expectations of him, to be completely autonomous, if you will, whereas Shane is so preoccupied with maintaining the status quo, with protecting himself and their relationship by avoiding chaos of the unknown. So that's the end of this analysis, but if you guys have some lingering questions, you can put them in the comments below. If there's enough of them, I could do a full video on that Q&A section there. Or I could even go into my predictions for the third book. Rachel Reed just said that she's doing a third book called Unrivaled. That's about Ilya and Shane. And I got some predictions about how that would all square out. And that's it. Bye.